Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I have been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to move forward through another training camp together. As always, you can always find our 100% free 24/7 boots on the ground coverage of the Jaguars when you follow us on social media such as Facebook and Twitter at Jaguars on SI. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Today, we are talking about what we've seen from Trevor Lawrence in training camp so far. Now, this, of course, is following Friday's scrimmage inside the stadium. It's not taking into account whatever happens on Sunday's training camp practice, which would be the 9th training camp practice under Liam Cohen so far. But I don't necessarily even think that, we need that 9th practice to kind of factor into my stance on his first 8 practices so far. Now, I think it's important context to remember that training camp is just that. Training camp is a time for teams to put very, very specific situations together, very specific play calls together. Sometimes they're just going to try things. So it's not necessarily, a complete one-for-one. This is what would happen in a game or anything like that whatsoever. With that said, I do think you can get some value stuff out of training camp just in terms of how does a guy's mechanics look, how is his overall accuracy, is the ball getting, from point A to point B, how's it coming out of his hand? As Urban Meyer would say, you need to stand right there and hear the ball come out of his hand. What a time that was. Nonetheless, what I've seen from Trevor Lawrence in past training camps, and I also want to preface this. Trevor Lawrence has always, in my opinion, kind of been an up and down guy in training camps, in practices. He'll have some really good practices, some practices where he's just on the money, isn't missing. And then he'll have some practices where it's like, the defense definitely won that day. I've always thought of Trevor more as a gamer than a true practice guy. And I think the fact that, practice should be used for trying to do different things, trying to see really what you can get away with. I think there's a lot of value in that, but still, nonetheless, I do think that Trevor, throughout his career, has not been the best practice quarterback. That isn't also to say that, this guy has been terrible in past training camps. That's not true. It's just been more of an inconsistency, but he has certainly had strong training camps before. He has had strong training camp practices. The one he had in the stadium, and I think if you're just looking at the totality of past scrimmages / mini games or whatever those kind of look like, for the Jaguars in recent years, I think Friday night was the best he has looked in the scrimmage. And, of course, that's not exactly a Lombardi trophy. Nobody's hanging a banner for it looking good in the scrimmage. But if that's purely what we're evaluating, because that's all the sample size we have right now, I'd say Trevor Lawrence checked all the boxes during the scrimmage. There were 2 throws, and I mentioned these in yesterday's podcast, that Trevor Lawrence, definitely should have won him back. There was one throw early, first drive. Tank Bigsby pops a run, about 10 or so yards. De'Ami Brown, good gain over the middle. Brendan Strange, another deep gain. Gets into the red zone, and Trevor put a perfect football on Brian Thomas Jr., and, DeAndre Prince knocked it out. Really good play by Prince. And then Trevor, they had a handoff, and then Trevor attempted to get the ball to Travis Hunter in the end zone, who was going over the middle of the field, but Ventrell Miller knocked it away. And I think that was definitely one of the throws he should want back. And the other one, the interception, clearly, Zach McPherson, not Zach, excuse me. Zach, McPherson is a guy who has kind of stood out at times throughout training camp. And this was definitely one of those plays where he just read the route combination really well, dropped off, and, definitely not a good decision by Trevor Lawrence. It was one of those interceptions where you're almost like, did he see that guy who was, dropping off from the route, etc. I think other than those 2 throws, though, Trevor had a really impressive, to me, scrimmage because of some of the throws that he made. I'm not talking about the last one, the Britton Strange, which was a red zone touchdown. He might have got sacked on, but one of those touchdowns to Brian Thomas Jr. was a really tight window throw. And then he had two layered throws. One to Travis Hunter to the left sideline, one to Brian Thomas Jr. on the right sideline. That, to me, just really stood out as, wow throws. The one to Travis Hunter, he just barely got it over the cornerback. And, Travis Hunter obviously made a nice catch down the field. It would have been a big game. Big explosive play, chunk play. And just the way the football is coming out of Trevor's hand to me. I mean, I don't know if it's the change in mechanics and the tweaks he's made, but it looks like it's snapping out a lot more, coming out with a lot more velocity. He's driving some power behind his passes a lot more. To me, maybe the arm strength is showing a little bit more. And I think over the course of training camp, over the last several days, you guys have heard me say that he's been impressive. He's made some good plays in the red zone and training camp practices. Probably more so than he made in the red zone in the scrimmage last night. He did have 3 red zone touchdowns, but I do think the red zone on Friday night is definitely where he probably, found his biggest inconsistencies. In training camp, though, red zone's definitely been an area where he has struggled in training camp practices before. And he's made, several throws in the red zone in this training camp to me. They've been wild throws. I still think about the one to Parker Washington early in camp. It was even before pads came on, but Caleb Bransall was right there. Jordan Lewis was right there. And, he was able to fit the ball to Parker Washington for a touchdown on a really impressive play. So I think it has been, of course, this is only through 8 practices. There's still a couple more weeks of training camp. But I think through 8 practices, I'd say probably, one of the better training camps Trevor Lawrence has had. The question, of course, is how much does that mean moving forward? Because, again, nobody is hanging a banner for having a good training camp practice. We've seen guys before play, poor or inconsistent in training camp and then go on and have stellar seasons. I've seen it several times. And I've also seen guys who have been, gone absolutely nuts in training camp, not really do much when the lights come on. I mean, look at Garrett Prince in Kansas City. He was a guy who made a ton of plays that training camp, and he just ended up being nothing really more than a practice squad tight end. So I think you have to take it, into account that you're just talking about training camp when you talk about these evaluations. But to me, Trevor Lawrence, especially over the last 4 to 5 practices, I'd say, is somebody who is starting to get some positive momentum and is somebody who is, to me, having one of his better training camps. And again, I say this as somebody who I've seen him in training camp, constantly throughout his career. I've seen the training camp practices where he has struggled. I've seen the ones where he's played really well. And to me, you're starting to see a little bit more of the consistency. Now, I'm going to pull up Liam Cohen's, quote on Trevor. He said, he thought, very first of all, he was asked how Trevor played, and he said he thought he played awesome. He then went on and say, quote, I thought he was making sharp, fast decisions. The ball was getting driven constantly. I thought it was getting driven. He missed a few for sure. He missed Travis down the goal line behind when Ventrell Miller made a great play, but that ball's got to be out in front. The interception's a tough one. Parker took a little long on the route. We had an out and a corner combination down here. The guy that had the out covered fell off. He lobbed it in the back of the end zone. Just move on, progress, or throw it in the back of the end zone. But I thought he just made good, sharp decisions. He drove the ball. I thought he ran the show well. I thought it was a good night for him. End quote. To me, Liam Cohen saying those things is important because Liam Cohen is very honest. Liam Cohen actually, to me, is one of the few coaches I've covered who, when giving a press conference, and I think assistant coaches are honestly better about it because they're not up in front of the podium all the time. I can understand why head coaches don't do it, but Liam Cohen has given some of the more honest and blunt and direct and detailed answers. So I think ultimately that Trevor Lawrence is trending in the right direction, but he has to show it in week 1. That's the bottom line. It really doesn't matter. And, it's funny to say after we've spent the last 10 minutes talking about it, but it doesn't matter how he looks in training camp at all if he doesn't perform when week 1 comes. But I do think the little things that you can evaluate, that you can, say, okay, this does carry over to the regular season into real football, such as his footwork, his mechanics, the way the ball's leaving his hand. I think it's been a positive training camp for Trevor Lawrence. Thank you guys for listening to today's episode. Please make sure you like, follow, subscribe, review, whatever you have to do on Apple Podcasts and Spotify when you find us at the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast.